Books represent an attempt to permanently hold on to information, thoughts, and stories. That's assuming you have any intention to actually hold on to what's inside of them. Not everybody does. Hello there, folks. Tomorrow is the beginning of Banned Books Week. And if you've heard of it at all, odds are you know it best as that time when your local library or bookstore sets up a little display with a bunch of books saying Banned Books Week and offers up books that have at some point been banned. And if you've ever actually taken a look at one of those displays, you may have found yourself scratching your head at some of the things included there. I want to take this opportunity to talk about something that has been on my mind a bit lately, and actually on other people's minds as well, off and on. Be nice to see it on their minds more consistently, but that is the increasing number of book challenges that have been going on in America, in libraries, and especially in schools. Now, just for clarification of language, the difference between a book ban and a book challenge is the challenge is the beginning of the banning process, where somebody challenges the presence of a book in a certain location, be it a college, a high school, a grade school, the school library, the school curriculum, or the public library. Now, not every book that is challenged is ultimately banned, although any book that is banned, it started as a challenge. Now, even though this is called Banned Books Week, what I'm actually going to be talking about are book challenges. My reason for doing that has to do with the way that data is correlated by the American Library Association. What they track year over year are book challenges. It might be possible to actually find out how many of these challenges actually went through and became full bans, but that data is not collected in the same way and would be much harder for me to find and be able to parse. This, however, is available data. And I have to thank my partner, Liz, who is a school librarian, for helping point me to the resources that I need to be able to talk about this. Now, if you're wondering why I want to talk about this, well, some of you might remember that there has intermittently been a little bit of an uproar over certain books being challenged or banned. The most notorious recent example is probably the banning of the graphic novel Mouse by a Tennessee school board. Mouse is an incredibly renowned, celebrated story about the Holocaust, and it was removed for containing quote-unquote nudity. That's mouse nudity. And that sort of backdoor way of trying to ban something that does have business being available, we'll get into that. But this is kind of what I want to talk about. A lot of the conservative movement, especially the far right, have decided to make libraries, especially school libraries, battlegrounds. And the number of challenges has spiked. The nature of the challenges has gotten uncomfortable at times within the last few years. And this is also why you see targeting of things like Drag Queen Story Hour being held at local libraries. Libraries are frequently a battleground in anything that could be considered a culture war. That's not a term I usually like to use, but I do feel it is appropriate. When a group is attempting to remove the availability of information they don't like, they are engaging in a war against the culture and demanding that it be what they want it to be. So the data that I'm going to be using and citing across this, again, comes from the American Libraries Association. And they have done detailed breakdowns year over year for quite a while. Those started in 2015. I do have data going further back than that, and I'll cite some of that earlier on, but the really detailed information, or at least that was collected in a way that was much more parsable for me, that starts in 2015. So what this will mostly be looking at is the trends and how things have changed from 2015 to 2021. It stops 2021 because that is the most recent year fully collected. Nothing that's gone on in 2022 is going to be part of this data set because they won't collect it until we are into the next year. So that is going to be the range of time that I'm primarily going to be focused on. I'm going to be looking at what has changed in terms of what books are getting challenged, on what basis are they getting challenged, who is challenging them, and in what institutions. Because if you look at the data and see how things have shifted, there's some interesting and troubling trends that emerge. Now, before I start really digging into numbers, it's worth just kind of breaking down the nature of a challenge. This is when someone, and the people involved are also part of the data set, whether it be a patron, which usually refers to someone who is patronizing a local library, a parent, which means it's somewhere involved in a school. It could either be part of the curriculum or it could just be available in the library, or other outside forces or students even. These people will say, we don't believe that this book should be available at this location. Again, whether it's the school, the library, wherever they are making the objection. That will then be looked into, a book challenge is made, and it is then considered whether or not it will be removed from the shelves. The reasons for a book challenge are not set in stone. This is not a legal proceeding where there are certain specific things that you have to be able to prove that it is this or that. The exact criteria that will get something removed varies wildly from location to location. And so what you will find is that in some areas, you will see citations of things like anti-family or anti-authority, or even things like Satanism and the occult, which may not turn up at all in other locations where those sorts of things are not considered to be concerns of the local populace. So I will be talking about, amongst other things, some of the most cited reasons for a challenge. And the kinds of books that can be challenged, literally anything. Literally anything can be challenged. Nothing is immune. And that runs the entire gamut from resource books to children's books, whether it is a sweet and adorable illustrated story about two male penguins raising a chick based on real events, or whether it's 50 Shades of Frickin' Grey, anything can be challenged and potentially banned. So with that in mind, let's start looking at some numbers. When examining older data, it's basically lumped together as 1990 to 1999 and 2000 to 2009. And there wasn't a great deal of significant shift from one decade to the other in terms of who was making the challenges or why. There were a couple of shifts in terms of an increase in the number of challenges made by other initiators and on the basis of quote unquote other objections, but that mostly has to do with a failure to fully categorize this older data. So a lot of stuff just kind of gets lumped under other. Starting in 2001, we start getting the list of the top 10 most challenged books in the country, which is going to be a fairly big part of what I'm talking about here. Now, I'm not going to go over what every top 10 was for all those years, but I will be citing some specific instances as I feel it emphasizes or illustrates something that I feel is important. Now, it's worth noting that from 2014 to 2020, the most challenged institution is the public library. From year to year, the percentage of challenges that happen there can run anywhere from 38 to 66%, but all of those years from 2014 to 2020, that is the category with the most challenges, no matter how low or high the percentage is. It's a bigger percentage than all the others. However, 2021 saw something different. It became the first year where the most challenges took place in the school libraries. And for the record, it was 44% to public libraries, 37%. So it wasn't even particularly close. There was another shift that happened before that, in that starting in 2018, more bans began to happen in school libraries as opposed to over school curriculum. Now, this is an important shift because it marks a distinct change in attitude in the people who are attempting to get these books banned and removed. What I mean by that is, prior to 2018, in terms of the years that we have good data for, the most common thing in relation to schools to challenge is the actual school curriculum. Books that children or teenagers were assigned to read, meaning these these books were literally put in children's hands by teachers and parents for whatever reason, justified or not, went, oh, wait a minute. And for a long time, that happened more often than just trying to ban it out of the school library. But in 2018, that shifted. What that means in terms of a difference in mentality is it went from, I don't want my child to be required to read this, to a higher degree of emphasis on the idea of, I don't want this available to my child at all. That's an important change, because objecting to something in the curriculum, it can be not over the simple existence of that book, but simply because you don't feel it's something that should be required. But since 2018, shouldn't be there at all, has become the prevailing attitude. It is worth noting that 2020 is the one exception year in terms of there being more library bans than curricular bans. But like 2020, the data for that year, while accurate, is wonky and out of place because of COVID, because so many of these institutions were closed. As I'll mention later, it had by far fewer book challenges than it happened in really any of the years since 2010. And the data is off and weird because a lot of libraries were closed, a lot of schools were closed. So it's data that is not consistent with every other year already. That doesn't mean that data from 2020 is not helpful in some other ways, because, for example, when I was looking at the reasons cited and what the more common reasons were, or what some new ones were that appeared that hadn't showed up before, 2020 was where we started seeing books challenged because of Black Lives Matter or being anti-racist. I will say that again. Books in 2020 began being challenged for being anti-racist. That's not an interpretation. You need to understand that when the ALA assembles this data, they are lumping things together, but they are lumping it under the descriptions given by the people challenging them, because they do have to offer, like, what is your general categorization? And as I'll get into with some of these are very blatantly just trying to ban things that they don't like, that most people would think, is that a bad thing to have? Such is the case with anti-racism. And if you think this is just a matter of, well, the ALA is making some kind of editorializing there. They took these arguments of these patrons or these parents and are saying that they didn't want something because it was anti-racist. The parents probably didn't say that. Well, given some of the language that appears in other years, such as in 2021, woke, making a notable dent in the number of challenges that were based on it, I don't think the ALA decided to lump things under woke. That would have been a word that the parents or the patrons chose to use. Now, I doubt anyone's going to be particularly surprised by the fact that I am going to put a focus and a spotlight onto books challenged for containing LGBTQIA+ content, queer content. So yeah, that has been going on a lot, but it's also been going on a lot for a while. In years prior to 2017, pretty much everything got lumped under other categories. There was a section for homosexuality, and it's possible that transgender-related things or any gender-related things were lumped under that, or possibly under another category. Now, starting in 2016, homosexuality no longer appears by itself. It got lumped under LGBTQ, later to become LGBTQIA+, because, yes, they acknowledge there are other letters involved in that. But then, starting in 2017, it became the number one reason for book challenges, and it remained so ever since. Until 2021, where sexually explicit surpassed it. Now, sexually explicit is a category that's basically always been there. And it's a basis that most parents would at least understand, well, that might be a concern. What's the context? How explicit? What age? So there is a reason to certainly have the sexually explicit content as a basis for a challenge. And as I said, it's always been there. But I think it's really important to understand why in 2021 it overtook LGBTQIA+. Because it's not because more sexually explicit material became available in these locations. It's because virtually every book that was challenged because it contained queer content was also challenged as being sexually explicit. This has been part of the targeted tactic of the far right for the last few years, and it really ramped up in 2021. There is a reason that groomer has become a go-to term that the far right will use for anybody standing up for any queer rights, especially the rights of trans people. It is because they want the idea of sexually explicit and sexually predatory to be linked implicitly and always with queerness. So the reason sexually explicit became the number one in 2021 is because it appeared on nearly every single challenge done to a queer book. And then there would also be some books challenged for sexually explicit content that didn't have queer material. So it rose higher because it was pulling double duty now. And let me show my homework a little bit on this, because in 2021, looking at the top 10 most challenged books from that year, every single one of them that contains some kind of queer content is challenged not only for containing that, but for also being sexually explicit. The only exception is the book This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson. That one is actually a sexual education book. And so instead of being marked as sexually explicit because it's in an educational context, it instead got challenged on the basis of being sexual education. I'll repeat that. The basis for a challenge was that it was educational. Another thing to note about queer books, since LGBTQIA+, or any of its variants that might have been a little bit shorter, was put in as a category, that has accounted for the number one most challenged book of the year every year since that term became a category, with only one exception. That exception being 2017. And the reason for that was because of 13 Reasons Why. Now, 13 Reasons Why actually came out back in 2007, and it was number 3 of the top banned books in 2012, but it hadn't been on the list since then. But the Netflix adaptation brought attention back to it. So for depicting suicide, that shot it to the top of the list, where normally queer content has been easily unchallenged. And the main reason queer books lost the top spot there was because of a literal cultural phenomenon. Now, I said that since being introduced, LGBTQIA+ books have easily made the top spot and a large amount of the categories. And since being introduced, it has accounted for no fewer than 4 books out of the top 10, and it has gone as high as 8 books in the top 10. That was in 2019. But even on its lower end years, for that category to show up in at minimum 40% of the top 10, that's pretty solid representation. Why don't we contrast that real quickly for how frequently homosexuality came up as a category before they were using LGBTQIA+. From 2000 to 2009, homosexuality only made up 7.5% of all challenges. Now, keep in mind, since being introduced, LGBTQIA+ was the number one basis of a challenge every year except for 2021. Homosexuality was 7.5% for a decade. So getting into years that I have a little bit more data on, going from 2010 through 2016, which was when LGBTQIA+ first got introduced, and remember, it started being the number one reason in 2017, homosexuality, or books being banned on the basis of homosexuality, ranged everywhere from 0 in the top 10 to 3. So as recently as 2011, we had years where none of the books in the top 10 were being banned on the basis of portraying homosexuality. But then once we have LGBTQIA+, year after it first starts showing up as a cited reason, it's number 1 until sexually explicit. Now, I mentioned earlier that 2019 was the year with the most of the top 10 being books with queer content, 8 out of 10. The 2 that had no queer content, for the record, were The Handmaid's Tale, again, kind of brought to prominence again due to the creation of a show, a bit of a cultural movement, and the Harry Potter series for some reason. I had to try and think about why that would have been, because understand, while it is fairly well known at this point that Harry Potter was challenged or banned, especially early into its popularity, for depicting the occult and magic and Satanism and all this utter nonsense. For as absolutely zero respect as I have for J.K. Rowling at this point, like, those challenges were absurd. But Harry Potter made the top 10 again in 2019. That's after a 16-year hiatus. Last time it made the top 10 was 2003. What is going on there? Well, at a guess, it's actually a possibly unintended side effect of the increased focus on queer books. Because when you collect and energize and encourage a population that flatly does not want queer content made available in any way, shape, or form to, well, anybody, but especially anybody still in school, you are going to have a higher percentage amongst that group of people who also object to Harry Potter, most likely for religious reasons. So I think the fact that Harry Potter showed up again is a side effect of the concentrated effort to energize and encourage more book challenges, especially on queer topics. Because amongst the people who are going to do that, you're going to get more people who have issues with Harry Potter. So with that in mind, it actually is not surprising that the year with the most queer books in the top 10 also saw the return of Harry Potter. Now, I'd said before that from 2017 to 2021, there was no less than 4 books in the top 10 with queer content. There actually was one exception, but that was 2020, which again was wonky for reasons I already mentioned. But there's another reason why there was slightly less. The thing is, 2020, as I mentioned before, saw the increased attention to books depicting issues of race. And what I mean by that is depicting the perspective of people of color at all. So that year saw the banning of things like The Hate You Give, Something Happened in Our Town, All American Boys, and Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. All of these were challenged on the basis of being anti-police or anti-racist. And if you think the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement kicked off then is somehow a coincidence, well, one of those books, All American Boys, had an interesting specific challenge in at least one instance, which was that it was, quote, too much of a sensitive matter right now. The moment in time when the most attention is being drawn to the problems of specifically police violence against Black people is not the time to talk about issues of societal or police violence towards Black people. And you may have already noticed that with Stamped, there's an interesting one that it was challenged because it did not discuss racism against all people, which is the book challenge equivalent of All Lives Matter. Yeah. Okay. Now, even though 2020's top 10 was heavily dominated by racial issues, the number 1 most challenged book was still an LGBTQIA+ book. Stick a pin in that specific one. I'm going to come back to it later. But while we're on the topic of racially charged reasons to ban something, I want to take a look specifically at the book The Hate You Give. And more specifically, I want to take a look at the reasons cited for it being challenged, because there's a shift in language on that one. Now, The Hate You Give is illustrative and helpful because it's been in the top 10 most banned books for 4 out of the last 5 years that we have data on, between 2017 and 2021. And so I'll explain what the basis for the challenge was initially when it was first challenged in 2017, and then how that language changed. In 2017, it was challenged on the basis of being vulgar, depicting drug use, and containing profanity. In 2018, it was challenged for being anti-cop, which would remain when it was in the top 10 again in 2020. And then in 2021, it still has those other things I've cited, but it is now added indoctrination of a social agenda. The use of that language and the fact that woke appeared in 2021 really gives the game away of who is pushing for these challenges. Because this language specifically has been either manufactured or reappropriated and then pushed very hard and in a very unified way by far-right media, politicians, and activists. Nothing was challenged on the basis of being indoctrination into a social agenda any year prior to 2021. It would have had no reason to be. But these are the buzzwords. These are the buzzwords drilled into the ground level supporters who are being egged on and encouraged to go and forcibly remove books from libraries and schools. And it is getting worse. From 2001 to 2014, the number of challenges per year. Now, this isn't number of books challenged, but number of challenges, because sometimes you can challenge multiple books at a go. So the number of challenges during that stretch, 2001 to 2014, it ranged from 311 to a high of 547. Now, that was in 2004. 2006 was very close behind. It was actually only behind by one for the most. But that was the range, 311 to 547. 2015 actually saw it dip below 300 total challenges for the first time this millennium. And then it ranged from 323 to 377 from 2016 to 2019. Now, this is generally trending downwards. We're seeing fewer. The highs in the previous stretch, up in the 500s, we're not hitting those now. Things seem to have calmed down. Now, does that mean society was more accepting? Not necessarily. More likely, a lot of schools or libraries were preemptively removing things that they thought might have been challenged or simply weren't ever putting it on the shelves in the first place, simply to avoid the hassle of having to deal with this stuff. Can I prove that that's the case? No, but if I were to guess, that was at least partially responsible for things going down. Fewer things to object to. Now, 2020 only saw 156 challenges, but again, we've talked about why 2020, the data is actually super unhelpful because of how many of these institutions weren't even open. But then, 2021, it came roaring back. 729 challenges in 2021. And from what data I could find, it's not official yet, and it won't be till next year, but from what data I could find, 2022 is on pace to already have beaten that, and to probably leave it completely in the dust. The scale and the scope of the problem should already be evident based on 2021. When we get 2022's data, I expect it's going to become incredibly clear that this is a chosen battleground. So I said there was a book I wanted to highlight. Now that book is Melissa. Now, Melissa, originally published as George, it has since been retitled since George is actually the main character's dead name. And eventually the author was convinced that maybe that shouldn't be the title of the book. I mean, the story deals with the character's transition over time. So it's not like the name shouldn't appear in the book. Maybe it shouldn't be the title, though. But in any case, Melissa first made the top 10 list of most challenged books in 2016. It's been in the top 10 every year since then, and it's been number 1 in 2018, 2019, and 2020. This is the story of a young trans girl. It humanizes her, it gives the reader reasons to empathize and understand her, and it has never stopped being among the most challenged. And a 3-year stretch as the most challenged, that's pretty impressive. Part of the reason I want to highlight this book, though, is this was a book that my partner Liz, again, a school librarian, she had to deal with a challenge to its presence in the library. And I feel it is illustrative. Now, I mentioned before that LGBTQIA+ became a very top category, but that's nationally. The feeling towards that kind of thing will vary from community to community, from state to state. I live in Vermont. Vermont is a fairly progressive state in most areas. And as a result, it wasn't challenged simply for depicting LGBTQIA+ characters, because honestly, that wouldn't fly here. It would other places, obviously. It is used as a basis of a challenge often enough to show up as such a high-ranked reason, but because of the nature of how things are around here and the generally tolerant attitude towards most queer populations in most parts of this state, instead, the parents who challenged this book tried to challenge it as being sexually explicit, or actually, I'm sorry, their words were that it was pornographic. So they claimed that because in this non-illustrated book, at one point, a character comes into possession of an adult magazine, like a Playboy, effectively, that makes the book pornographic for acknowledging the existence of these magazines. That challenge did not succeed, for the record, but it was something that Liz had to go through. And that tactic was chosen for the same reason that nudity was used as a reason to remove mouse. If you don't live in an area where it will be allowed to go through, to ban it for the reason you actually don't like it, because it addresses the Holocaust, because it depicts a trans character in a sympathetic light, well, then you find another reason. This is the library equivalent of when you work a job, there are a ton of reasons why your employer is not allowed to fire you. Tons of bases by which they can't fire you. They can't fire you for your religious beliefs. They can't fire you for your race. They can't fire you for your sex. But the thing is, they can find a reason to get rid of you that will be allowed. So, not that I'm trying to throw myself on the cross, but I got laid off from my last day job in 2020. Now, the official reason was they were doing layoffs due to COVID. Makes sense. I found out later that the only people laid off were me and one other person, that being a long suspected, absolutely redundant position in the design department. So despite the entire company, dealing with COVID and it crunching on the amount of sales we could get, on what could be produced, tons of areas where you would think they would have to make cuts. Because remember, I worked for a company that not only had a sales force, a marketing force, it had a production force, a lot of whom could not come in or could only come in under very restricted conditions because of 6 feet rules to come in and actually produce the stuff that was being sold. You'd think some of those people would go. No, just me and one other person. Now, I can't prove that they let me go because of my gender expression. And in the state that I worked, your gender and your gender expression was a protected category. But they can't let me go for that, but they found another reason. And I can't prove that that was really why they let me go, but I was presenting more and more and more as myself prior to the lockdown. And I've been incredibly close to some people who have worked in HR. I know for a fact that they will be careful about not firing people because of reasons they're not allowed to. But if the reason that a company wants to get rid of somebody is something not allowed, they'll find a quote-unquote legitimate reason. Same thing here. If you live in an area where banning a trans-positive book for being a trans-positive book isn't going to fly, or banning a Holocaust-related book for being a Holocaust-related book won't fly, find another reason. Find a technicality. And this is also in keeping with, as I said before, the deliberate connecting of queerness to sexual explicitness, to pornography, to predation. A couple of other little bits of data to keep in mind. Exactly who was initiating the most challenges generally went back and forth from year to year between either parents or patrons. As I said, in the case of schools, it's going to be parents. And if there are more challenges in a public library, it's going to be patrons. But what's an incredibly small percent? Students. Students don't think these books shouldn't be there. There was only 1 year where it was anything higher than 1%, and the highest it ever got was 3%. Students don't feel like they need to be protected from this. It's parents and it's patrons, community members, people who increasingly over 700 times in 2021, are acting very much deliberately with a clear political motivation. Now, I'm not saying that you can't have your politics guide your actions, that you can't act on your beliefs. But this isn't just people deciding independently on their own, I'm concerned. I don't think that book should be there. This is a coordinated offensive. This is right-wing figures telling the people who listen to them, go out and demand these books be removed. And we know that people are listening because in the challenges we see the same nonsense language about social agenda and being woke that you hear from these people. This is not an organic grassroots movement. This is manufactured, and it's going to keep getting worse. Libraries, repositories of information that people like the far right don't like are always early targets. I mentioned that drag queen story hours are being targeted for harassment, for threats, whether it be protests outside the building or people literally marching into libraries with guns to protect children from drag queens. People that, as far as children are concerned, are just really pretty people in shiny ball gowns with high hair. Librarians are being threatened simply for putting up LGBTQI plus displays, and multiple drag queen story times have been canceled due to threats of violence. That is not independent of the rise of challenges. That is not independent from the fact that school libraries overtook school curriculum. That is not independent of the fact that in 2021, school libraries shot past public libraries as the institution with the most challenged books. That is not independent of the fact that number one has almost always been a queer book, and that queer books make up such a high percentage consistently of the books challenged and banned, and that ones that aren't those are very likely in the last few years to be anything addressing injustice or racial issues. Our institutions of learning and knowledge are under attack. Because there's one other thing that I'll add into this. You remember how I said there was the shift from attacking the curriculum more than the libraries to the libraries. Going with a shift from saying, I don't think they should be required to read that, to, I don't think they should have access to that at all. There was a term that used to be among the most common cited reasons for a challenge that does not appear anymore. Inappropriate for the age range. Now, the thing is, depending on the book and depending on the grade it's available to, that can be a pretty lively debate. There is argument to be had. At what age are kids able to read certain things? At what age should they? That doesn't show up anymore. And the reason it doesn't is because it concedes the idea that there is an appropriate age. Maybe the age that has access to it right now isn't appropriate, therefore we challenge it. But that implies that there is some age that is appropriate. Now, you do not see that in the list of cited reasons at all, because they will not cede that ground anymore. They will not cede the idea that anybody should ever have access to information about racial justice and about queer people. Not in fiction, not in education. They want us to be made unacceptable. And it's hard to know how to fight that. Because you can't fight fire with fire. Doing a bunch of book challenges to conservative books is not going to do anything to help. That's just leading to a situation where nothing becomes available to anybody, and that's not helpful. So, what can be done? Well, There is often volunteer or donations that can be made to your local library or possibly your school's library program. Support these places. Support their ability to fight these challenges. Support knowledge. Support the existence of knowledge, the availability of knowledge. Support librarians. And we power through. And I fear that after Banned Books Week, people won't be thinking about this anymore, despite the fact that these challenges go on every day across the country, everywhere. Find out what's happening locally and find out what you can do to help. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to support the content that I make, Patreon is the best way to do it. It's what enables me to do this as my living after I was laid off from that job. So if you are not able to support me that way, like, share, and subscribe. Put the word out about what is going on as best you can. I would appreciate it. It would help this. It would help me. It would help people understand the scope of the problem, hopefully. But ultimately, what I really, really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Time to give my thanks to my highest supporting patrons. That would include Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Emu Delkey, Theotha Boyd, Becky Sparks, Fernabi Likes the Poodle, Zach, Idolin, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Adam RDL Taylor, Shane Ross, Shaylee Gourlay, Brendan LaRose, and TT. If you want your name said while these guys try and distract me, consider looking at the rewards of my Patreon.